settlements or agreement were being mooted, Wolsey would not trouble the king with every clause. He simply sent a digest or extracts because it should be painful for your grace to read the whole treaty. If Henry wanted to write personally to someone, he asked Wolsey to prepare a draft that he could simply copy out, but that was rare. The two men understood each other, and for a long time liked each other well, and this is the more remarkable since their relationship was, for much of the time, an impersonal matter of letters and notes carried by shuttle service between Wolsey in London and the king. Wherever he might be hunting or visiting, it made for long delays, especially as, even when Henry received the dispatches, he left them for days unopened or unsigned, while banquets, horses, or hawks consumed his interest. Wolsey became a man of magnificence, Archbishop of York in 1514, Cardinal and Chancellor in 1515, Papal Legate in 1518. The grandiose palaces he built were literally fit for a king, as Henry rapidly demonstrated when he cut Wolsey down in 1529, taking over Hampton Court, which Wolsey had begun in 1515, and incorporating York Palace into his new palace of Whitehall. Foreigners assumed that Wolsey was king in all but name, and scurrilous little rhymes circulated. Why come ye not to court? To which court? To the king's court, or to Hampton Court? That was by John Skelton. But Henry never totally abdicated the running of the realm, as ambassadors who were suddenly set upon by Henry, having their gracious proposals slashed through for the self-serving contrivances they were, came to realise Wolsey could be overruled, and the flaws in his plans laid bare by a royal intervention, which might be rare, but seldom failed to grasp a problem firmly by the scruff of the neck. And there can be no doubt that the great achievements of the period, the events that have made Henry VIII's reign one of the most decisive and formative in English history, his first divorce, the break with Rome, and the creation of a new dynamic autocratic monarchy, all these stemmed directly and solely from Henry himself. Still, for over a dozen years, Henry left to Thomas Wolsey the day-to-day running of English affairs, and such were the priorities of both king and cardinal that for much of the time this meant foreign affairs. Domestic responsibilities were either ignored or scornfully flouted. Parliaments, called in 1510, 1512, 1515 and 1523, were methods of raising money for foreign adventures. One can indeed almost date Henry's wars from the years when he deigned to call Parliament, and the Church was treated with equal casualness. Wolsey regarded it simply as the mechanism by which he maintained his European eminence, the source of his titles, dignity and wealth. Spiritual or pastoral care did not figure prominently on his list of priorities. He always held at least one other bishopric in addition to York, and never visited the seats of any of them. Though not a monastic priest, he held the Abbey of St. Albans for the sake of its wealth. He openly sold bishoprics and promotions to the highest bidder, and despite his vows of chastity and celibacy, he not only fathered a son, but bestowed upon the infant some most valuable benefices. It is probably true that during the period was Chancellor and took an interest in the law courts. Babor got good justice, but this was again a reflection of the cardinal's pride rather than his humanity. He sat in judgment in the Star Chamber by passing ordinary common law and hearing cases with such ceremony and authority that it seemed to some contemporaries and to some historians since that he must have invented some sort of special court. In fact, he was sitting in Star Chamber as a member of the Privy Council in its long-established judicial function, hearing cases brought directly by subjects who felt they could get no justice from the ordinary courts of the land. In later years, the council, sitting in the famous chamber with the multi-starred ceiling, did take on a certain administrative independence, but under Wolsey it was simply the style of the man that appeared to lend it an existence and glory of its own. Many petitioners benefited from the autocratic impartiality of his decisions, but that was an indirect benefit they were lucky to get from Wolsey's delight in power. After all, one of the most king-like things that he, a commoner, could do was to dispense justice like some latter-day Solomon to the poor and needy. Foreign ambassadors were most impressed, and it was the respect of Europe that Wolsey courted, not affection nearer home. Within months of gaining the king's ear, Wolsey had pulled off his first coup. Henry had returned from Tournai, thirsting for a second, more ambitious campaign against France in 1514. Ferdinand of Spain and the Emperor Maximilian were to join in the triple attack, but both Ferdinand and Maximilian, true to form, played false. They concluded secret treaties with France, leaving Henry alone to launch the offensive, from which they had nothing to lose and much, if it proved successful, to gain. They must have been very pleased with themselves. But there was a new hand guiding England was said that Henry divided up England between the two obstinate men that governed everything, yet Suffolk's friendship with the king never at this time threatened Wolsey's power, and his trip to France in 1514 closed a chapter in whatever immediate political ambitions he may have had. For, as a cover to his mission to plot Ferdinand's destruction, he was supposed to act as Henry's representative at the marriage and coronation in France of Mary Tudor, generally supervising the welfare of the English king's beautiful young sister. He played the part too well. Mary, then 18, was one of the icons of the age, a nymph from heaven, a paradise, said the Venetian ambassador. There had been a public outcry against her proposed marriage to the toothless old Louis XII. So let's just have a look at this painting. We have a dragon up in the sky there on the left hand side, and you can see Henry VIII on his horse. So let's see what it says about this. Okay, it is the Field of the Cloth of Gold, the meeting place of Henry and Francis I of France in June 1520. In the left foreground, Henry and Cardinal Wolsey are shown arriving in procession, and at the top of the picture the two sovereigns meet. So, as I say, we can definitely see Henry VIII there. I think maybe Cardinal Wolsey is at the back. And I imagine this is the encampment here. And Mary had consented to the match only when Henry promised her that she could marry the lover of her choice when Louis died, which occurred within 11 weeks of the marriage. Mary was free, not simply of her husband, but also, through her brother's promise, of the obligations that conventionally bound princesses to sacrifice their passions on the altar of diplomacy. Louis's lascivious nephew and successor, Francis I, however, had other ideas. His uncle was scarcely cold when every evening he forced his attentions upon the beautiful widow whom Suffolk by now thought a more than patriotic duty to protect. This image here on the left shows the marriage of Louis XII of France and Mary Tudor. Francis was importunate with her in diverse matters, not to her honour, wrote Suffolk indignantly to Henry. A more serious threat was the possibility that Henry might go back on his word and marry off his sister to the nephew of Catherine of Aragon, the Archduke Charles, who was shortly to succeed to the possessions of both the Emperor Maximilian and Ferdinand. So here he is, Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain. Henry's offspring above Margaret's in line of title to the throne. Mary and Suffolk were forgiven. By the time the two lovers apprehensively reached England, the royal wrath had cooled, and their clandestine liaison was publicly solemnised at Greenwich on the 13th of May, 1515, in the presence of Henry and the entire court. Wolsey was probably distressed that Mary could no longer serve as a pawn in his European designs, but her marriage did mean that the Suffolks would have to live away from court. For though their indiscretion was forgiven, it could not be too openly flaunted. Henry would hunt with less substantial companions, and the cardinal alone would have the king's ear. So on the left here we have the wedding portrait of Mary Tudor, Dowager Queen of France, and Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, 1515. And here on the right, Antoine Macot, presenting his translation of Diodorus of Sicily to Francis I, who is shown surrounded by his children and his court. The only problem of the whole episode was the role played in it by this new French king, Francis I. Once his lascivious proposals had been stamped on, Francis had done everything in his power to hasten the young lovers' union, and of course to frustrate the possibility of a marriage alliance between England and the Habsburg heir. To that extent, the marriage had played right into his hands, and Francis provided Henry with many other causes of irritation. 20 years old, of military ability, which he soon demonstrated, and good looks, which were described literally as devilishly attractive, the French king replaced Henry as Christendom's rising star. Francis wrote, "The Bishop of Worcester is tall in stature, broad-shouldered, oval and handsome in face, very slender in the legs, and much inclined to corpulence. He sounded like a mirror image of Henry." This rival aroused not only Henry's envy, but also his suspicions. For that very summer, Francis dispatched from his court to Scotland John Stuart, Maximilian and the Swiss if they would take up arms against France. Both accepted the proposition and the money. Henry had practically bankrupted his father's treasury in his 7 years of extravagant rule, but neither took up arms with any seriousness. At the beginning of 1516, they marched boldly into Italy and marched boldly back at the first sign of resistance. Meanwhile, in January 1516, Ferdinand of Spain, enthusiastically supporting Henry's plan for a pan-European alliance against France, dealt one last crooked hand to his English son-in-law. He died, and to the throne of Spain succeeded the Archduke Charles, who was more than delighted promptly to desert Henry and to conclude a treaty of friendship with Francis. At Noyon, Spain professed every goodwill towards France, and the Emperor Maximilian, Charles's grandfather, was invited to join in the reconciliation, a possibility which sent cold shivers down the spines of Wolsey and Henry. More wagon trains of English money were dispatched to keep the Emperor on their side. Maximilian received them graciously. Mon fils, he chuckled to Charles, voilà les trompeurs, les Français, et moi, je vais tromper les Anglais. My son, you are going to cheat the French, and I am going to cheat the English. In the spring of 1517 he joined the signatories of Noyon. England was, with scarcely concealed contempt, left out in the cold. Wolsey's only hope lay in the first part of Maximilian's aphorism, for Charles, in fact, did not intend to remain eternally true to France, and realising this, Francis also began putting out feelers towards England. So suddenly, from being disregarded, objects of ridicule, Henry and Wolsey became centres of European attention. Perhaps the most amazing spectacle in all these years of fevered and complex diplomacy was the one that took place in St. Paul's Cathedral on the 3rd of October 1518. There, Cardinal Wolsey sang a glorious High Mass, while in front of him knelt the King of England. All the lay and spiritual peers of England, and representatives of the Pope and every major European power, all giving thanks to God for the universal and eternal Christian alliance for international peace, which had just been signed, and which took setting Henry up as a third candidate, and once Charles had been elected, sandwiching Francis between Spain and the imperial client states which stretched from the Netherlands down to northern Italy, England became, very obviously, the moderate make-weight she'd always been, though even in this modest role, Henry VIII was to succeed in staging the most gorgeously magnificent event of his entire reign, a reign which was already richly endowed with more than a few extravagant occasions. One of the clauses which had marked the signing of Wolsey's great treaty of universal peace had been a declaration by Henry and Francis to sink their past differences and to meet personally in the following year, 1519. But the imperial election had intervened. As a token of goodwill, Henry swore he would not shave until the two monarchs met. He rather fancied himself full-bearded, and not to be outdone, Francis